Granville, New South Wales, 1989. Dawn. The Bobcats are already on site when John Dunn arrives. He is 62 years old. He has spent 33 years designing trains in this factory, and he has maybe an hour before the demolition crews destroy every drawing, every photograph, every engineering record Commonwealth Engineering ever produced. He rents 2 garages. He fills them with filing cabinets. A colleague from the Railway Historical Society takes 6 truckloads from the Queensland plant before anyone can stop him. Here is what was almost erased, the complete record of the company that built the trains running in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide and Hong Kong. The company that had, at that exact moment, designed a train good enough to win New York City. How do you destroy something that survived 2 world wars, dominated an entire continent, and was 1 contract away from conquering the most famous city on earth? You don't compete with it. You sell it. Chapter 1. The Coach Builder's Dream. It started with Rolls-Royces, which is not how you'd expect Australia's greatest train factory to begin. But here we are. In 1921, 3 men set up a workshop on Parramatta Road in Camperdown, inner Sydney. Frank Waddington was a British-born cinema owner, money, no manufacturing experience. Arthur Spurway Smith was a New Zealand-trained master coach builder, skill, no capital. Charles Leslie Fares was another coach builder, formerly of May Brothers. Together, they formed Smith and Waddington, and they started handcrafting timber and leather bodies for luxury automobiles. Within 2 years, by some accounts, approximately 85% of all Rolls-Royce cars sold in Australia were wearing a Smith & Waddington shell. Stop and think about that number for a moment. 3 men, a workshop in inner Sydney, 2 years of operation, and they had effectively cornered the prestige end of the Australian motor body market, not through technology or scale, through craft. It was never going to last. The mass production firms, Holden's Motor Body Builders, other American-backed operations, were eating the market from below, and then the Depression hit. In July 1930, Smith and Waddington went into liquidation. Frank Waddington injected fresh capital. The company reformed as Waddington Body Company. And for the next several years, they survived on bus bodies and repair work. Not glamorous, but enough to keep the doors open. The move that changed everything came in 1937. They relocated to Granville, in Sydney's western suburbs, to a site sitting directly between the Great Western Highway and the main Western Railway line. You couldn't have picked a better location for a company that was about to pivot from bus bodies to rolling stock. The rail corridor was literally on the back fence, but the factory that built Rolls-Royce bodies was about to be taken over by something bigger than any private company. A world war was coming, and when it arrived, everything changed. Chapter 2. The government steps in. The Second World War did what nothing else could have done for a mid-sized Sydney motor body builder. It made them indispensable. By 1943, the federal government had taken a controlling stake in the Granville plant and converted it entirely to war production. The workshop that had once crafted leather interiors for wealthy motorists was now producing Bellman hangars, the portable steel structures used to shelter aircraft on wartime airfields, along with steel pontoons, ocean-going lighters and freight wagons. More than 200 of these structures came off the Granville line during the war years. The scale of transformation, achieved in months, speaks to something that was genuinely impressive about Australian manufacturing capacity in that era. When directed and funded, it could pivot faster than almost anyone expected. In 1946, the company was formally renamed Commonwealth Engineering Co. Limited. The government owned it, had rebuilt it, and had given it a mandate. The luxury coach builder was now a national industrial asset. The next critical decision came in 1955. Commonwealth Engineering signed a licensing agreement with the Budd Company of Philadelphia, one of America's premier rolling stock manufacturers. The deal gave the Australians access to Budd's stainless steel, shot-welded construction technology. the same method used to build some of the most durable passenger cars in American rail history. Australia's first stainless steel rail cars were the direct result. It was a technology transfer that would define the company's engineering identity for the next 4 decades, and, as we'll see, eventually give them the tools to pitch for New York City. The government sold its shares in 1957. On the 1st of January 1963, the company renamed itself Comeng Holdings Limited. The transition from wartime state enterprise to private rolling stock manufacturer was complete. Here's the thing. Without the war, without the government takeover, without the forced modernisation of the 1940s and the Bud licensing deal of the 1950s, there is no train factory. There is just a liquidated luxury coach builder from inner Sydney. Every part of what made Comeng great was built on a platform the government constructed. That fact matters later. It matters a lot. Now they had the technology. Now they had the mandate. Time to build an empire. Chapter 3. 5 factories, 4 states. The Granville Gate in those years, and if you'd stood there on a Friday afternoon shift change in the early 1960s, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about, was a river of men. Hard hats, work boots, the smell of cutting fluid and paint and metal that never quite left your clothes. Hundreds of workers streaming through at the end of a shift, heading for the pub down the road, the tram stop, the train that would take them west through Parramatta and beyond. Families all over Western Sydney built their lives around that gate. Then came Rockley in Brisbane's southern suburbs, the former Rockley Munitions Works, where during the war years approximately 137 million rounds of ammunition had been manufactured. Comeng took over the site in 1949, converting former munition sheds into railway carriage production facilities. The old laboratory became administration. The scale of the repurposed site gave you some sense of what serious industrial production looked like. Not one building, but dozens, spread across a complex that had once been producing ordnance at wartime rates. Bassendean, in Western Australia's Swan Valley, came next. Then Mittagong in the NSW Southern Highlands, opening in 1973 to handle freight rolling stock that Granville couldn't absorb. At peak, across all 5 sites, Comeng employed somewhere in the range of 7,000 workers. The exact figure is contested across different industry analyses, but 7,000 is the number that appears most consistently in the historical record. Into this world, sometime in the mid-1950s, walked a young engineer named John Dunn. He joined the Granville operation and began working his way through the company's design divisions. Wagons first, then more complex passenger stock. By the 1960s, he was part of the team designing the double-deck carriages that would define Sydney's suburban rail for a generation. He would spend 33 years there. He would know every corner of every drawing that was ever produced in that building. In 1970, Comeng delivered 124 stainless steel coaches for the inaugural Indian Pacific service, the first standard gauge passenger train to run continuously between Sydney and Perth. It was the kind of contract that made you understand the scale of what this company had become. Not just Melbourne's trains, not just Sydney's, an entire continent. But what Comeng was about to build in Melbourne would define a city for half a century. Chapter 4. The trains that defined a city. In 1979, the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board awarded Comeng a contract for 103 car sets of electric multiple units, the new suburban trains that would replace Melbourne's ageing fleet. By the time the contract was complete, it had grown to 190 sets, 570 individual carriages. They were Melbourne's first air-conditioned suburban trains, capable of 115 kilometres per hour, and the first set entered revenue service on the 28th of September 1981. If you have ever caught a train in Melbourne, there is a reasonable chance you have ridden a Comeng. As of early 2026, approximately 109 3-car sets are still running. They have been in service for more than 40 years. The company that built them has been dead for over 3 decades. But trains were only part of the Melbourne story. The tram fleet, the iconic Melbourne trams that tourists photograph and locals take for granted, is substantially a Comeng product. 230 Z-bar class trams, built between 1975 and 1983. 70 A-class trams, 132 B-class trams, including Melbourne's first articulated trams and its first air-conditioned trams. Stand at a Melbourne tram stop today and watch what rolls past. Comeng built it. Sydney got a different product line, but no less significant. The S-set double-deck suburban carriages, 359 of them, transformed the capacity of the Sydney network through the 1970s. The V-set intercity fleet, 246 carriages, ran for 55 years until their retirement on the 30th of January 2026, repainted in their original Blue Goose Royal blue and grey livery for the farewell. The XPT Express train, adapted from the British Intercity 125, set an Australian rail speed record of 193 km per hour during testing. For Western Australia, the Prospector rail cars, described at the time of their delivery as the longest and fastest diesel rail cars in the world. For Queensland, 86 electric locomotives built with Hitachi for coal haulage on the electrified Blackwater and Goonyella systems. For South Australia, 20 diesel-electric rail cars whose body design borrowed directly from the Melbourne EMU shell. Here is the number that stops conversations. More than 2,600 vehicles across all types, across all states, across a production life spanning 4 decades. Every major Australian city running simultaneously on Comeng steel. The Sydney Harbour Bridge extensions reinforced with Australian rebar. The Snowy Mountains tunnels board and braced. And every suburban train carrying people to and from the work that built those things. Also a Comeng product. It was a level of industrial ubiquity that the country has not seen before or since. But the bigger Comeng got, the more dangerous the factory floor became. And the company knew it. Chapter 5: The Price of Progress. Steel fabrication at industrial scale is not a safe occupation. It was less safe in the 1960s and the 1970s than it is now. And it was less safe then than it should have been, even by the standards of the era. The Granville and Dandenong plants both carried the hazards common to heavy manufacturing: paint booths with inadequate ventilation, pressing machinery that could take a hand before you had registered the sound, overhead cranes moving loads across shop floors where the clearance margins left little room for error, falls from height in the structural assembly areas, chemical exposure in the finishing departments. The specific accident statistics for the Comeng plants across their full operational life have never been comprehensively published. The company's records on this point were among the materials ordered destroyed in 1989. What the union records and parliamentary testimony establish is that serious injuries were not uncommon and that the compensation and rehabilitation systems were inadequate for the scale of what was happening. The migrant workers bore a disproportionate share of this. The post-war waves of Italian, Greek, Eastern European and later Lebanese workers, who made up a significant portion of the Granville and Dandenong workforces, tended to be concentrated in the dirtier and more dangerous operations. Safety signage in English was of limited use to men who had arrived 6 months earlier and were still navigating the language. The AMW delegates, the Amalgamated Metalworkers Union, the dominant union across Comeng's facilities, fought consistently for better conditions, better pay, and better communication. They won some of those fights, not all of them. The Hong Kong contract of 1987 and 1988 brought all these tensions to a head. Comeng had won a contract to build 70 light rail vehicles for the Tuen Mun Mass Transit Railway, the company's first significant export order, opening what management hoped would be a doorway into Southeast Asian markets. Industrial action at Dandenong, triggered by a dispute over conditions and manning levels, threatened the delivery timeline. Penalty clauses in the contract were severe. Management's solution was to split production between Dandenong and Rocklea, an improvised logistical scramble that barely got the vehicles shipped on time. 67 of those 70 Hong Kong vehicles are still running. As of 2026, refurbished and renewed, indistinguishable from newer stock, the workers who built them in the chaos of that disputed production run never got to see them in service. Most of them were gone from the industry within 3 years. But by the time the Hong Kong trains shipped, something had already changed in the boardroom. The engineers working the Dandenong floor didn't know it yet. They were about to find out. Chapter 6. Turning Points, the pipeline runs dry. In Victoria, the Comeng EMU contract of 1979 to 1981 was the last great domestic fleet renewal that would come Comeng's way. The timing was not coincidental. By the early 1980s, the political and economic environment in Australia was shifting in ways that would prove fatal to companies like this one. Bob Hawke won the 1983 election. Paul Keating became Treasurer. What followed was one of the most rapid economic liberalisations in Australian history: tariff reductions, financial deregulation, and the beginning of the end for the protection that had sheltered domestic manufacturing since Federation. The Button Plan, the industry restructuring program named for Industry Minister John Button, pushed manufacturing toward rationalisation and efficiency, on the theory that exposure to global competition would force the productivity improvements that protection had made unnecessary. The Steel Plan, the Automotive Plan, the Textile Plan, each one a variation on the same argument: compete or die. For Comeng, the first concrete consequence was the Tangara contract. Sydney needed a new generation of suburban trains to replace ageing stock. Comeng bid. The contract went to A. Goninen and Granville, a Newcastle-based engineering firm. The reasons were contested cost, capacity, delivery timeline, but the outcome was clear. Granville would not be building Sydney's next suburban fleet. The pipeline that had fed the factory for decades was beginning to run dry. By 1986, according to John Dunn's account, domestic railway rolling stock contracts had effectively dried up. Bids were being made, in his words, on a score of fronts internationally and returning nothing. The Dandenong plant still had Melbourne trams and the Hong Kong contract, but Granville was looking at a horizon with very little on it. Then Comeng looked to New York, and for one extraordinary moment, it looked like they were going to win. Chapter 7. The New York Dream. The connection to American Rail began in 1955 with the Budd Company licensing deal. Budd had been building stainless steel passenger cars for American railroads since the 1930s. The California Zephyr, the Texas Eagle, the equipment that defined mid-century American passenger rail. Their technology, transferred to Granville, had given Comeng the engineering foundation for everything that followed: the stainless steel construction, the shot welding process, the approach to structural integrity that made Comeng cars last 50 years in service. By the mid-1980s, Budd, by then a subsidiary of German conglomerate Thyssen, was exiting the railroad business entirely, and the Long Island Railroad, America's busiest commuter railroad carrying more than 300,000 daily passengers into Penn Station, was looking for someone to build its next generation of rolling stock. Here is the kicker. The LIRR's initial request was for single-level cars, conventional, safe, nothing remarkable. Comeng persuaded them to consider a bi-level design instead. A double-deck car. In a commuter railroad running through the East River tunnels under Manhattan, where the clearance is 14 feet and 6 inches, and you have precisely zero room for error. The engineering problem was extraordinary. The commercial opportunity was bigger. 3 bidders went up against each other. Comeng in joint venture with Mitsui, against Alstom of France, against the Sumitomo and Nippon Sharyo Consortium from Japan, the world's established rolling stock manufacturers, competing for what could become the template for a generation of American commuter rail. Comeng was selected as the preferred bidder. John Dunn later described this moment in interviews gathered for his 5-volume history as simultaneously the greatest achievement and the greatest loss of his professional life. The engineers had done everything right. The design was sound. The bid was competitive. The client wanted Australian trains under the streets of New York. Back at Granville, the gate was still open. The shift was still running. Workers were finishing V-sets for NSW, not knowing that the factory could, in theory, have been retooled for a contract that would have opened every American commuter market, New Haven, Boston, Chicago, to an Australian manufacturer. It was, in the documented words of the company history, virtually in the bag. Then someone pulled the plug. Not New York, not a competitor with a better design or a lower price. A merchant bank in Sydney and a rubbish tip in Madrid. Chapter 8. The Man Who Cashed Out. In November 1982, Australian National Industries, ANI, acquired Comeng. ANI was a heavy engineering conglomerate with a reasonable reputation and a diverse portfolio. At the time of the acquisition, the deal looked unremarkable. A large engineering company buying a large manufacturing subsidiary, standard corporate consolidation. By 1985, ANI was reporting 18 consecutive years of profit growth and more than $1 billion in total annual sales. The numbers looked fine. Here's what was underneath them. ANI held a 45% shareholding in Spedley Holdings, a Sydney-based merchant bank. Merchant banking in late 1980s Australia was a particular kind of recklessness, conducted at a particular kind of pace by people who had confused a property and equities boom with their own intelligence. When the boom ended, Spedley collapsed. The collapse cost ANI approximately $200 million. The share price went off a cliff. Into this carnage, in April 1989, came Kerry Packer. Packer's Australian Consolidated Press launched a takeover bid for ANI. By June 1989, ACP held approximately 48% of ANI, acquired as the share price crashed to $1.40. Packer now controlled the parent company of the enterprise that had just been selected as the preferred bidder to build trains for New York City. In 1991, Packer's interests sold a European waste management company called ABT to ANI. The purchase price was $2 million. What ANI was actually acquiring was a commitment to build a $300 million waste treatment facility in Madrid, a project that analysts now estimate cost somewhere approaching $400 million to complete, with the overruns carried entirely by ANI. The total damage from the ABT transaction has been estimated at approximately $1 billion in losses. A Queensland barrister, Bob Ellicott-Cussy, conducted an independent inquiry into the affair in 1997. Its findings were never made public. ANI's board declared the report potentially defamatory. Kerry Packer exited his ANI position with an estimated profit of $200 million. With ANI hemorrhaging money and its share price destroyed, the company could not provide the financial guarantees required to secure the IRR contract. Comeng was forced to sell its C1 bilevel design to Mitsui. Mitsui contracted Tokyo Car Corporation in Japan to build 10 prototype vehicles for $22.4 million. The cars entered LIRR revenue service in August 1991. New York loved them. 134 production C3 cars followed, built by Kawasaki to a design conceived in Granville, and they are still running on the LIRR's diesel branches today. Back at Granville, the gate had a chain on it. Workers arrived in the mornings to find notices on the fence. Granville closed in June 1989. Rocklea wound down shortly after. Bassendean was sold to A. Goninan and Comeng in 1990. Only Dandenong survived, and it was sold to AB Transportation, a Swiss-Swedish engineering conglomerate, also in 1990. Australian ownership of Australian train manufacturing ended not with an announcement, not with a parliamentary debate, but with a series of asset sales processed through the insolvency of a merchant bank. Chapter 9. The last train out of Granville. They kept working until the last possible day. That's the thing nobody outside manufacturing culture quite understands. You don't stop because you know it's ending. You work because the work is what you are. In June 1989, the final V-set carriages for the NSW rail fleet rolled off the Granville line. The workers who built them, men who in some cases had spent 20 and 30 years in that factory, received their redundancy notices and cleared out their lockers. The employment records of people who had given 3 decades to a company were processed and filed. The gates shut. And then the order came down to destroy the archives. Management directed that all records with no immediate commercial value be disposed of. In practical terms, that meant almost everything. Decades of engineering drawings, thousands of photographs, corporate files reaching back to the 1940s. The accumulated institutional memory of one of the most productive manufacturing operations in Australian history, ordered into skips. John Dunn was 62 years old, and he was not prepared to let it happen. He hired 2 garages and filled them with filing cabinets, working against the demolition schedule. A colleague from the Railway Historical Society drove to the Rocklea plant and took 6 truckloads of material before the crews could get to it. Between them, they saved a fraction of what existed. A&I stripped the assets, purged the place, Dunn recalled later. Everything with no immediate commercial value went. Men and women with 40 years of experience, innovative, creative people were turfed out. Many without a cent. The workers who left Granville in mid-1989 found themselves in a domestic market that had no use for their specific skills. You could not transfer the knowledge of how to build a double-deck stainless steel rail car to another employer in Australia, because there was no other Australian employer building double-deck stainless steel rail cars. The retraining programs that government agencies promoted produced mixed results at best. Some workers found their feet in adjacent trades. Many did not. Meanwhile, in New York, the C1 cars designed in Granville were carrying commuters into Penn Station. The factory that conceived them was a building site. The trains outlived everything. Chapter 10. The country that forgot how to build. In the years after the Granville closure, something became visible that had been obscured by the existence of Comeng. Australia had no plan for what came next. The New South Wales government, in the decade following 1989, ordered approximately 1,980 rail carriages and light rail vehicles from overseas manufacturers. Not some of its rolling stock, most of it. The state that had housed the most productive rail manufacturing operation in Australian history was buying its trains from Japan, Canada, Korea, France, China and Spain. In 2017, New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian stated publicly that Australia and New South Wales were not good at building trains, and that this was the reason they needed to buy them from abroad. The statement was made without apparent awareness of the irony. The country was not good at building trains because it had systematically dismantled the institutions that had built them. It had then spent a generation not building trains. The degradation of capability had been mistaken for evidence that the capability was never there. The AMWU submission to the 2016 to 2017 Senate inquiry into the rail industry put numbers to the damage. Rail manufacturing employment in Australia had fallen 40% in a single decade. The country was importing $1.4 billion worth of rail equipment annually. It was exporting $98.8 million. The trade balance in an industry where Australia had once been self-sufficient and internationally competitive had inverted completely. The survivors of the Comeng production chain were scattered. At Dandenong, the factory had passed from ABB to Adtrans in 1996, from Adtrans to Bombardier in 2001, and from Bombardier to Alstom in 2021. Through all the corporate name changes, the site kept producing. In November 2024, Alstom celebrated the factory's 70th anniversary. Among the workers present were Richard Sholton, who had started there in the 1980s under Comeng, and his son Mark, who joined as a teenager and helped build the Endeavour and Explorer railcar cars for NSW in the mid-1990s. 2 generations, 1 factory floor, across 4 different corporate owners. The continuity was human. The institution was gone. The green shoots are real but fragile. The Albanese federal government's National Rolling Stock Procurement Pipeline, announced in May 2024, attempts to coordinate state orders into a sustained national program. The NSW Minns government committed $87.7 million in the 2025 to 2026 budget toward a locally manufactured Tangara replacement, with a 50% local content target. The political language has shifted. The question is whether the institutional memory required to execute on that language still exists. If you stand on the Granville site today, there is nothing left, but the trains are still running. Chapter 11. What Remains? Part 1. Physical Return. The Granville factory site today is residential and light industrial. If you walk along Woodville Road looking for any trace of what was here, you will not find it easily. High-rise apartment buildings occupy the northern end of the former complex. Light industrial units cover the south. There is no heritage marker, no interpretive display, no plaque. Nothing to indicate that the land you are standing on was for 50 years one of the most productive manufacturing sites in Australia. The main Western Railway line still runs directly alongside the site. Trains pass every few minutes. They are not made here. They are not made anywhere in New South Wales. The last train manufactured in this state rolled off a production line that no longer exists, built by a company that no longer exists, to carry passengers on routes that are now served by trains imported from Spain and South Korea. At Rocklea, in Brisbane's southern suburbs, the former munitions laboratory that became Comeng's Queensland Administration Building still stands, heritage listed by Brisbane City Council, recognised for both its wartime significance and its manufacturing history. The rest of the site is a general industrial estate. At Dandenong, the factory is alive. 500 workers, Alstom signage, ongoing production. The only plant in the Comeng chain that survived corporate predation, transferred from owner to owner, but never demolished. It is the exception that makes the others more painful. The Granville gate is gone. Apartments where the shift changed. Nothing to mark what was here. Part 2. 3 lessons. Lesson 1. Corporate owners. Don't build things, they extract them. Australian National Industries and Kerry Packer did not understand what they owned when they owned Comeng. They understood the balance sheet. They understood the asset value. They understood the liability exposure. What they did not understand, or did not care about, was that a manufacturing company is not a collection of assets. It is a knowledge system. It is 30 years of accumulated understanding of how to bend stainless steel into a shape that fits the East River tunnels. It is the institutional memory of how to manage a bi-level car contract against 3 international competitors and win. When the balance sheet needed fixing, the knowledge was treated as worthless. The demolition order was given. John Dunn saved what he could with 2 rented garages and a borrowed van. The 5-volume history he spent his retirement writing exists, all of it, because a corporation looked at 40 years of engineering archives and valued them at 0. Lesson 2. The Valley of Death is a policy choice, not a market reality. Comeng did not die because the market decided Australia shouldn't build trains. It died partly because Australian state governments procured trains in stop-start cycles that made sustained production economically impossible. A fleet renewal contract every decade. A tram order every 15 years. The feast and famine procurement pattern that the rail industry calls the Valley of Death was not a natural market condition. It was a policy choice, the accumulated result of state governments procuring independently, on their own schedules, without national coordination. The AMWU analysis submitted to the 2017 Senate inquiry demonstrated that coordinated national procurement of approximately 300 rail cars per year would sustain a world-competitive domestic industry. That number was achievable. It required coordination between state governments that has historically been difficult to achieve in Australia, but it was not impossible. The coordination was available. Nobody built it, and the companies that might have benefited from it were gone by the time anyone started taking the argument seriously. Lesson 3. What gets destroyed cannot be rebuilt on command. When New South Wales Premier Chris Minns announced in 2025 that the Tangara replacement fleet would be manufactured locally with a 50% local content target, it was the right announcement. It was also an announcement made into a void. There is no Comeng to call. There is no organisation carrying the institutional memory of how to design, tender and build a stainless steel bi-level car for Australian conditions. There are individual engineers, now in their 70s and 80s, some of whom worked on the C1 design that New York loved. There are 5 volumes of history rescued from 2 garages by a man who died before he finished writing them. You can write a cheque for a new factory. You cannot write a cheque for 50 years of accumulated engineering knowledge. Part 3. Final Echo. John Dunn died in January 2013. Volume 5 was not finished. His colleagues completed it. 5 volumes. 350 interviews. 40 years of Australian industrial achievement. Rescued from 2 rented garages on the day the Bobcats came. Somewhere on the Long Island Railroad's diesel branches today, a C3 car built to a design conceived at Granville is pulling into a station on the way to Penn Station. The passengers are reading their phones, looking out the window, thinking about whatever they think about on a commute. Nobody on that train knows where it came from. They survived a war. They didn't survive a phone call.